Okay, so we are recording at this time. And this will be our Blender. So we are working with Blender 3.4.1 in this classroom. Blender has a lot of, I actually have a couple different versions of Blender running on my home station, depending on what I need. But each Blender version does have a different splash screen. Okay, so if you are watching a tutorial in the future, and you notice that the splash screen is different, if they show this to you, you can also look in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see it right here to see if it's not clipped off for the tutorial, what version they're running. And this can be really important because, as you'll see, there are like UI differences that do impact the way that you might engage with this. Okay, so we're just going to start off. Notice that there's a bunch of different types that we can work with. I'm just going to choose the general out of this, or you can just click away from that splash screen. Okay, so I'm not going to start there yet. What we will always have in the general view is this cube, a default camera, and a default light. Okay, so I'm going to leave this in here. However, a lot of tutorials will instruct you to tap A on your keyboard to select all in the frame and tap delete just to get rid of it. Now you have a blank scene. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hit Control Z here, which still works inside of Blender, so that we do have something that we can look at as we start to zip around. You'll notice that it does feel like Maya, just kind of starting out, but the hotkeys are different. They did recently adjust this so that it's a little bit more standard because Blender was a little silly, but everything sort of revolves around the Shift key. So if I hold down Shift and middle mouse button, click in, you'll notice that revolves around the middle mouse button. Shift and middle mouse button is going to allow us to pan up, down, left, right, where we typically in Blender would have, or in Maya would have held down Alt, right? If I hold down Control and middle mouse button, that will allow me to dolly, right? You might interpret it as a zoom, right? And just middle mouse button will allow me to tumble, okay? So everything in Blender revolves around that middle mouse button key. So I'm just going to add those in here. So middle mouse button by itself is going to be our tumble. What we typically in Maya would do as an Alt and left mouse button. Right, everything's middle mouse button. Okay, so Shift and the middle mouse button, and then Control and the middle mouse button. So Shift is going to be our pan, and Control is going to be our dolly or zoom. Up, down, left, right. Okay. Some other hotkeys that do carry over. I'm just going to click once to select the cube in my scene, and I'll tap F, or F is the one that is like always trips me up. So in Blender, they do expect that you'll have a full keyboard at your disposal. So a lot of the hotkeys do revolve around the number pad. If you look down at your computer, that bank of numbers all the way to the right. So on the number pad, usually when I'm inside of Blender, I have my my keyboard like this, so that my thumb can just kind of jump up onto the number pad. So I actually like tilt my keyboard up so that I can still use my mouse, but like jump up like this. So with my thumb of my mouse, because I'm a right mouse hand user, I'm just going to jump up and tap the period key on the number pad. It's also shared with the delete key. That's going to be my focus in or frame in, which was something really, really frustrating to me starting out in Blender, where I was just always tapping F and then inadvertently changing some of the behaviors of the tool sets here. So I'll add that one to our bank of numbers. So numpad period, right, will be focus in or frame in on the selected objects or object. A few other common distinctions that we'll have. Blender is very GUI in terms of its panels and everything. Maya is trying to do that, but it's still very rigid. So we'll notice here as I hover over the bottom, one of the things that I would suggest that you do as you jump into the effects is just to give yourself more space for the timeline below. Right, so I'm just hovering between them and pulling that up. Another area that I really honestly, I just cannot, I still can't wrap my head around it, is pulling off different panels to customize the viewport. So as you hover over, notice how this panel stops and it like sort of rounds on the corner. And we see that on all of the corners anytime a panel ends, right? As you hover over that little black area on that rounded corner, right? Notice how it changes very quickly to a crosshair. As soon as you see that crosshair, this is where you can actually split your view, right? So as you start to click and drag here, right, you can split the view. Now I have two separate panels that I can manipulate, right? And I can change this one to something else. It doesn't have to necessarily be a camera. So same thing here. I'm just going to go to the convergence of two panels, right? And if you want to, if like it just like for me, I'm trying to merge panels. I can't. I don't understand. So what I typically do here is just right click, and you can so right click, and then you can split it, right? So what I just did was a vertical split. I sliced it down vertically. So if I wanted to also do one that was a horizontal split, right, I could take this one and dice that one in two, right? So you can really customize your viewport in a lot of different ways. Let's say I didn't like this, right? Or I accidentally dragged off a copy that I didn't intend. No problem. I'll right click on that section where we were before. And say join areas. Right, and this will allow me to basically merge two places together. I'll just right click and say join areas and just merge this back to its original state. Oops. See, this is what I'm talking about. I think it likes to merge to like the right. I don't get it. I really don't get it. But if it ever ends up like this and you just, it's like all over the place, that's fine. Notice up at the top, very similar to Maya's workspaces, there are different tabs where you can, jump to whatever you're trying to do. So if you're trying to paint or UV edit or sculpt, right, there are different panel layouts that you can work on. I'm currently in the layout, right? So you can see right here, I could add in a new general layout, right? And it's back to the beginning. I could also right click this and say reorder this to the front. I could also right click on this and say delete, right? There's lots of different things that you can do just by clicking and selecting things up here. And you can rename them too. So if I want that to be back at layout or layout for effects, I don't know, whatever it is that you're looking to accomplish with that text component. Okay, so far we have moving around in the scene, focusing around that middle mouse button. We have different ways to merge or expand different panels. Let's take a look at the panels themselves and how we can customize this. Specifically for some of the effects, you'll go into some of the node editing. So in the upper left-hand corner, and again, if you're ever watching tutorials on YouTube or whatever, and you're like, that doesn't look like what I have, right? But we're in the same version. I would encourage you for each panel, just look up to the upper left, right? So here, right? Each one of these panels, that upper left is going to indicate what you see through that panel. So for example, this little icon here is my timeline. So in this bottom panel, I'm going to see the timeline, right? One thing that I noted as I was just kind of like looking at some of the node editors for the tutorials, some of them are a little bit older, but they still stand up. However, the icon is different. So if you notice if they're talking about the geometry node editor, notice here how it's sort of like a little bubbles or whatever. I think even 3.2, I think it was a different icon. So just play around with it. A quick Google search will also be, do you favors. Or if it's way too complicated, just choose something else. There's a lot more tutorials for the effects. Right, so the geometry node editor, and we'll see that pop up right here. Right. Other things. So far, right, we just want to remember the upper right icon for each panel. describes the panel. Okay, other differences, I'm going to switch that back to the timeline. So we're back to the traditional layout. Other things that, Blender can do a lot. It's not as deep as Maya is, and I'm sure there's people who would like legit fight me on that. But Maya is just much more monstrous, right? We might notice that even in the file menu, right? We're used to this thing changing depending on what mode we're in. And you might note that we have, oh, wow, we have an object mode. That kind of feels like modeling mode. So this dropdown is not the same as the dropdown that we have inside of Maya. And of course, I am in the 3D viewport when I'm looking, that's the first thing that we have here. So this is similar to how we right mouse button, click and drag into vertex mode, right? Enter the component mode, which Blender refers to as edit mode. So notice I do have to have an editable object selected to go into edit mode between object mode and edit mode, right? And once I'm in edit mode, I can select the vertex, the edge, or the face, right? So where in Maya, we would have right mouse button, click and held, drag to edge to get into edge mode. In Blender, we go into edit mode, right? Edit the components, and then grab the specific component that we're trying to work with. Then if we wanted to right mouse button, click and hold and go back to object mode, we would just have to do that here. Okay, so that's a big difference from Maya to Blender. It's more like philosophical than it is, application. But there it is. The nice thing about this for these objects is we can just hit tab, right? So tabbing into edit mode, and that's a toggle. So I can tab in to edit mode and then tab back out to object mode. So that's our next hotkey on the line. Right, so tab into or out of edit mode, right? It goes from edit to object. And of course, we do have to have an object that has components selected in order to tab into that kind of edit mode. Tab will get us into different types of edit modes depending on the object. But this is primarily where you'll find success for these FX interludes. Right, so now I'm back in object mode and I still have my little QB here selected. A few other things, we noticed that the W, E, and R keys do not work, right? So we do see them over here, right? The move, rotate, and scale tools. Okay, so let's try to move this object and scale this object with the new hotkeys available to us. So I'm going to hold down Shift and middle mouse button, click in to just kind of move around here a little bit. And my goal is to put my cube up here, right? And just make it bigger. So to do this, I actually, and I'm going to be a little bit blasphemous here because I am a Maya snob. I actually like Blender's movement tools better. I know, I'm sad too. So we can tap G, and I try to remember this as like go over there, right? So G for go over there. And then it will fuse to your mouse. So notice how, and I'm just going to tap escape to abandon that change. I'm going to move my mouse over here and tap G, and notice how it is offset. So I tap escape, and I'm going to go back to hover over the object and tap G again, right? Keeping in mind that this is doing this in perspective view, so this can be very disorienting. However, let's say I just wanted to go along the x-axis, the red here. I could tap G for go over there, then tap X, and it's going to lock it into that axis. So this is incredibly helpful. I wish Maya would do this, honestly, because you can very quickly type your way through a very specific, product. And for that matter, I could then type in the number 2, and for that axis, it would go 2 meters, because meters is what's being used here. So all I would have to do here is GX2, and it would go in the X by 2. And then I could just tap enter to accept that change. So I don't even have to touch my mouse for a lot of these edits, which is very exciting. So let's learn these hotkeys for move, rotate, and scale. So rotate is going to be R and scale is going to be S, but move or translate is the go over there. That's the only one that is silly. And then immediately, as soon as we tap those, we can tap any one of the axes. So let's try rotate for this example. I want it to rotate to become more like a diamond. So I'm trying to rotate it around the Y. And do note that Blender is one of those programs where we have a Z up environment. In Maya, we're Y up. Right. So in this example, I'm going to tap R for rotate, then immediately tap Y to rotate around the Y axis. And then again, I can type in -90, right? Maybe I should do 180 or something. I'll just put in 45, right? -45. So it doesn't have to be a positive number. And again, I'll just tap enter to accept that change or click. And of course, we can see over here on the side, this is sort of like our, not attribute editor, content, nope, channel box, thank you. Right, we can see that right here. Of course, I can type in these numbers directly here. All right, now let's go for scale. So again, I'll tap S for scale. I'll tap Z to scale in the Z. Right, and we can see how this is changing. And we should notice, let me actually gut this rotation just so we can see this a little bit better, because it is a little bit convoluted when we're working with that. But what you should notice with this, and of course mine is going a little crazy, is that it is tethered, right? So, and it doesn't matter, you can just tap S to scale. But again, notice where your mouse is. If your mouse is closer to the object, when you tap S, and then you start to pull that out, notice that there is this little tether, this little black dashed line that is attached to the center or the pivot point of the object, right? As I continue to move out, let me actually tap escape and come way out here and tap S. Right now, I'm going to have a much finer control. It's not going to scale as big because my mouse is further away. And as I hit the edge of the viewport, it actually regenerates up at the top so that you're not going to get to the edge of the screen. This is also a really nice product here. You can just very cleanly kind of scale, and it's going to, continue to work inside of the viewport. Okay. Same thing with rotate. So let me do that. I'll rotate around the X, so R and X. But notice that your tether, as your mouse is further away, you make a larger motion, and there's really not a huge change. However, if I get closer, let me tap escape. So if I'm R and I'm close, a small motion is going to make a bigger change. So if you feel like you're not in control, just move your mouse out. Right. And again, this is something that's very different, just like conceptually and how it works from Maya. Maya doesn't care where your mouse is when you're scaling. Right. And so once we tap one of these, if we want to lock it into an axis, we could also then enter a number and then tap enter. Usually I tap enter because for example, probably most commonly you're trying to rotate something perfectly by 90 degrees or -90 degrees. If you click, you run the risk of actually moving your mouse and editing it to like 91. So if you're editing on the keyboard, might as well stay there with the enter to accept that change. Okay. So moving objects around, customizing the UI. We also talked a little bit about the edit mode, so let's go a little bit more into that. I'll tap the number pad period to focus in or frame in on my object. Middle mouse button, click in, just to rotate around a little bit. My goal here will be to take these two vertices and just bring them out. So with the object selected, I'll tap tab on my keyboard in the upper left-hand corner. Right, tab will get me into edit mode from object mode. I'm going to make sure that I have the vertices selected. This is vert, edge, and face. Right, so with that selected, I can then grab my vertices, and then again, tap G and Y and shift them out. Right, G for go over there, Y to lock them into that axis. And I'll click to accept that change. One thing I also want to mention that is a difference in Blender, and messes me up all the time, is selection. So we're used to rubber band selections inside of Maya, making selections in infinite space, right? If this object has a what do you call that, vertex, anywhere within that bounding box, it will be selected. But in Blender, this definitely is not true. So it takes into account what you can see. Okay, so if I make a selection like this, I cannot see those back two verts, so they will not be part of my rubber band selection. This can be helpful, but because I'm just so wired like that with Blender or with Maya, it really gets me in trouble sometimes. However, we are, surprised, a hotkey away from making sure that it behaves in the same way as Maya. And that little button is way up here, referred to as X-ray. We do have an X-ray mode in Maya, but it's not used in the same way. Right, so I could click on this little button. My hotkey here is Alt-Z. Right, and now because it's X-rayed, I can see it. So if I make that rubber band selection, everything will be part of it. And Alt-Z back if you need it. It's a toggle. So Alt plus the Z key enters or turns off, right? It's an X-ray toggle. But it's also in the upper right-hand corner, right here. Okay. Other things, so you might be tempted to extrude something. So you could select the face mode, right? Because we extrude faces. And tap E on your keyboard just to extrude that. I could tap S on my keyboard to scale that down. Right, I could tap E to extrude again. Right, whatever we need to actually work with this. This isn't the modeling class, but I did want that. Extruding is like your bread and butter when it comes to models. So I just wanted to cover the E for extrude when you have a face selected in edit mode. Right, so E is extrude. We have to be in edit mode with a face or faces selected. Okay. Let me tab out of this. I'm going to tap tab. I'm back in object mode. I will take into account some of these snapping behaviors. So you can snap to increment, which they mean grid, vertex, edges, some other things that could be helpful in your Blender future. And we can see that hotkey right here. Soft select that we have inside of Maya would be here, toggling that on. Question? Nope, it's increment. So if you might have to tell it to absolute grid snap. If it's not, it might be just like too fine of a detail. So if that's true, you might have to turn that on to have it snap to grid. Yeah. And then helpful, but not really for this class. You can see that you can adjust the way that the gimbal behaves. So is it local? Is it based off of normal? Is it global? So those toggles are right here. Moving right along. We can also see the wireframe. So in Maya, we would tap 4 to get this, 5 to get this, 6, and 7. Right, so the light preview, the texture preview, and the flat shaded preview. This is where that X-ray was. And then here we can see the viewport overlays. So this can be helpful if you want to see the wireframe unshaded. Right, or other items that might be of use to you depending on what project you're working on. You could also holistically turn them off just by tapping this button. That brings us to our little view cube. So if you want to go into an orthographic view, you can tap on any of these. Right, as soon as you middle mouse button and click and drag, it's going to take you out of that. And you'll notice Blender is extremely well documented. So if you hover over anything, notice how it gives you the shortcut right here, and it also gives you a description of what's going on. So I could just tap also the number pad 7. I mentioned before that the number pad is very heavily used in Blender. Okay. The last thing I do want to mention over here, because this can be a little new. Notice this little tiny chevron right here. Right, you can click once on this to open up this little shelf. If you do have any plugins that you're working with, they would be here, right? They would populate right here. So right now, each one of these computers has BlenderKit as a plugin, loaded in. So if you download and want to install a plugin or an add-on to Blender, it would populate right here in a tabbed environment. I have to watch my hands do it. The toggle here is N. So if you want that shelf to come in, slide back in, you just have to tap the N key. The other side, the tools over here is T. So if you want that those tools to go away, that's fine. It's right there. Right, so I'm going to do a few viewport ones here. So T will be to toggle the tools, and N is to toggle that right side panel. Okay. Last little components here. Probably the one you'll use the most is the camera one right here. Number pad 0 is my hotkey. So this is to look through the animation camera. Okay, and as I hover over that, you'll see that the shortcut here is number pad 0. So again, the placement of your keyboard with your thumb being able to jump over to the keyboard is really helpful inside of Blender. And that's number pad 0. Right, is Anycam toggle. If you toggle into the animation camera and then try to move, it's not going to move the camera, it just snaps you out of the camera. However, if you want to move that thing, you can get into your side panel here. I'm tapping N on my keyboard. I'm going to go over to my view tab here and then say lock the camera to view. Now, if I go to move this, right, it's going to actually move and pilot that camera. So that can be very helpful, but I'm going to switch it off. To get out of that, you just toggle with this number pad 0. And again, I'll tap N on my keyboard to shove that panel away. Taking our tour further into this top side right panel, this is my outliner. Right? And in the outliner in Blender, everything is part of collections. So you can think of a collection as a group or as a folder, right? And we can create new collections right up here. And we can also select things from here. We also notice in our outliner, it's sort of like a souped up outliner from Maya, that it does give us these little icons right here that we can not only select, but we can also understand what this object is. So it doesn't really apply to us right now because we have nothing going on in our scene. But as you start to learn more about Blender, just pay attention to how these little icons stack up and what they mean. Usually inside of the outliner, I suggest that you go over to the filters and toggle on the selection and toggle off this one. Right, and this can be helpful because if I don't want anybody to, it's sort of like locking it. If I don't want anybody to select this object, I could just toggle that off, right? This can be very helpful for cameras that you don't want to accidentally move, right? The second one here is visible in the screen, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then the last one is this going to be present in the render, right? So if I didn't want this cube to render in my final visual, then I would turn it off like this. Okay, moving down to our properties, we can see the properties of the selected object. I'm going to select my cube here. For the most part, these top gray ones are going to be about the scene or about Blender, about how it renders, what's going on with like holistically the scene file. So things like the render engine and how it's going to render out. So this is where you would change it to 1920 by 1080, which is one of the requirements for the final product. Right, the printer icon is like what is going to output. So 1920 by 1080 at 100%, 24 frames per second, 250 frames, and where it's going to output to. So this is just going to a temporary file, so I'll just navigate to a folder. So this is just kind of like a rendering overview of how you're going to render for this class. So I'll just create a folder on my desktop called Blender Render and put it in there. Okay. So it's navigating, it's identifying that folder. I'm not rendering a PNG. I'm rendering a video file, an FFmpeg video file. And I do want to change the encoding properties of that file. By default, this will render out as an MKV file, which will lose you points. This has to be an MP4. So I'll just switch this over to MPEG-4. And we can see that it's at H.264, which is the default, medium quality, good, all this stuff is fine. Okay, but all that is under the output properties. And depending on what you're trying to do, so I'll just animate this real quick to 20 frames, sure. Okay, so right, that's my beautiful animation. It's only 21 frames, but I see in my printer that I have this 250 frames. I also see that number here. So I can reduce it here or reduce it here to the appropriate time frame. This can also give me more time. Okay, so again, that's either here or here. Both will change the other. Okay, and at 24 frames per second, I can expect 1 second out of this. Most of your animations will probably be like 4 or 5 seconds long for FX. For animation, what you saw me just do a moment ago was just animate the rotation on this, which I'll just delete very quickly and cover again. So I'm just going to put this back at the center. Actually, no, not because my camera's right there. But I'm selecting the object. You'll notice here, as I mentioned before, this little orange cubie is very similar to our content inside of Maya. And I want to animate the rotation. So I'll just hover over this bank of numbers and tap I on my keyboard for insert keyframe. I could also just click and drag right here to set a keyframe at this moment in time. I'll move backward in time, position the playhead. I then want to adjust the object, just move it slightly, right? And I could use anything, right? I could use these numbers. I could just like move it with my G, right? My hotkeys. I'll tap R on my keyboard and just go nuts and click. And then I'm just going to hover over the bank and tap I and I. Okay. I'll hit play to see that. And my animation is gorgeous. Okay. So a lot of your animation, you can get away inside of here, doing a lot of the location and rotation. You will see this probably a good amount. This is different modifiers. So that little blue wrench. And then finally down here at the bottom are the properties. Because this is a shape, it does have a shader involved in it. So this is similar to what we saw with our shader in Maya. So maybe I don't want this to be this color. I'm going to change this over to like a blue. And then I'm just going to jump over to my material preview so I can see it. Okay, so if I look through what my audience is going to see, we see this. So the last little step that I want to do here is execute the plan that I had for making this 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second. First 24 frames, I'm going to save here as an FFmpeg video as an MP4 final format. So last thing I'm going to do is render this out. And I'll go up to render and choose to render the animation. Notice render image, that's going to just be a flat image, and my hotkey here surrounds F12. So if I choose that, it's going to go through this. This is going to be really quick because it's very, very simple. And on my desktop, I think I put it on my desktop. Did I put it on my desktop? Yep. Here it is. So I would just rename this as my last name underscore FX1. And there it goes. So that's all I wanted to cover. We have 2 minutes to spare. Just right on schedule. Right, I guess last thing, I can save out this Blender file, right? So very similar to Maya or in Substance Painter. We have an SPP file, an MB file, but that's not necessarily the render file. So I'll just say file save as. This is more for you. We are only submitting the final MP4. And I'll just call this FX1. Okay, so here you can see that I have an MP4 file. Again, my view is showing the name extension, so you will see the MP4 here. But if you don't, just look at it in details and just see what the file type is. And that's what we're going for.